The air was thick with dust and the scent of charred metal. The ground rumbled beneath the feet of those who remained standing, a grim reminder that the catastrophe wasn't over yet. Fires crackled in the distance, illuminating the jagged remains of the collapsed mining facility, where hundreds had been working just moments before. Lieutenant Calla Rains scanned the wreckage with sharp, calculating eyes. "How many do we have accounted for?" she barked. 64 survivors extracted," Sergeant Milo Kent replied, sweat dripping from his brow despite the frigid night air of Oris 6. "But there are still at least 100 trapped below. We've lost comms with most of them." A few feet away, Ambassador Tvok of the Thalkren stood frozen, his elongated features twisted in disbelief. His species had overseen the mining operation on this barren moon, and they had always considered themselves superior when it came to efficiency, organization, and sheer physical endurance. But now his eyes flickered with something else: fear. "This is madness," Tvok muttered. "The structural integrity is failing. Our emergency teams have already pulled back. Any further attempts to rescue the trapped will only result in more casualties." Calla turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Then step aside." Tvok's pale blue skin darkened in what humans would recognize as frustration. "Lieutenant, this is not arrogance speaking. This is logic. There is no conceivable way your people can continue much longer. Your bodies are not built for this level of sustained exertion." Calla exhaled slowly, her eyes locking onto his. "Then watch." Without another word, she turned back to her team. "We're going in. The clock is running." And with that, the rescue mission truly began. The initial collapse had taken just 90 seconds. An underground tremor, a failure in the mining stabilizers, and then the entire eastern section of the facility had crumbled like a house of cards. The Thalkren emergency protocols dictated that after 2 hours of search and rescue efforts, all personnel should retreat due to exhaustion and risk assessment. But humans? Humans didn't work that way. Calla led the first wave, navigating through the ruined tunnels where oxygen was thinning and the heat from electrical fires made every breath sting. The walls were unstable and debris shifted ominously overhead. "Stay close and move fast," she ordered through her helmet comm. "This place is a coffin waiting to happen." Milo grunted as he lifted a fallen beam off a trapped worker, his muscles straining. The Thalkren, despite their advanced technology, had a reputation for fragility. Their bodies were built for speed and precision, not brute force. "Got you," Milo murmured as he pulled the injured miner free. Behind him, Corporal Alvarez was stabilizing another victim, a Thalkren engineer with a shattered leg. "Breathe easy," she reassured the alien, working quickly. "We'll get you out of here." Ambassador Tvok watched in disbelief from the surface as the humans defied every expectation. Their bodies were inefficient, he had always been told. They overheated, required too much oxygen, and fatigued quickly. And yet, they didn't stop. Hours passed. What should have been a 30-minute effort stretched into 6 relentless hours. The Thalkren emergency teams had long since withdrawn, citing physical limits and the growing instability of the tunnels. They urged the humans to retreat. The humans ignored them. "We've still got life signs deeper in," Calla said over comms, ignoring the burning ache in her arms as she pushed forward. "Nobody's giving up." Another section of the tunnel gave way, forcing Milo and Alvarez to dive aside, dragging 2 wounded miners with them. "Jesus," Milo gasped, coughing against the dust. "That was close." Calla's voice crackled in his ear. "Status? We're good. Still breathing." He turned his head and saw one of the Thalkren medics watching him in awe. "You are still going?" the medic asked. Milo wiped the sweat from his face and let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, buddy. We're still going." 8 hours. Calla's hands were numb, her vision swimming. She had lost track of how many they had pulled out, how many fires they had put out with their limited extinguishers, how many makeshift tourniquets they had tied. Tvok could barely process what he was witnessing. His people had long believed that humans were unremarkable, a relatively new species in the galactic hierarchy, valuable mostly for their adaptability but not endurance. But now he was seeing something else entirely. The humans weren't just enduring. They were thriving under pressure, feeding off exhaustion as if it were fuel. Their movements slowed, their hands trembled, but they did not stop. Tvok had never seen such a thing. The tunnels were on the brink of total collapse. "And yet, we have 3 more. Calla's voice cut through the comms. "I need a clear path out." The ground beneath them groaned ominously. The final stretch was the most dangerous. One wrong move could bring the entire tunnel system down. "Calla, it's too unstable," Milo warned. "We don't leave people behind," she snapped back. Tvok found himself gripping the railing as he watched the human rescue team push forward again. He had assumed, no, he had been certain, that they would have stopped long ago. But humans didn't stop. 12 hours. By the time the last survivor was pulled from the wreckage, the first rays of the twin suns were cresting over the barren horizon of Horus 6. Kala stumbled as she stepped onto solid ground again, her limbs screaming in protest. The other members of her team were just as wrecked, clothes torn, bodies bruised, exhaustion written into every fiber of their being. But they had done it. 124 lives saved. Tvok stared at them in stunned silence. He had always believed his people to be the pinnacle of discipline and efficiency. But after what he had just witnessed, he realized he had been mistaken. The humans were something else. Something terrifying in their persistence. You, he finally spoke, his voice hoarse. You should not have been able to continue for this long. Kala, barely able to stand, managed a smirk. Guess nobody told us that. Tvok exhaled, shaking his head in astonishment. Humans. They weren't just survivors. They were relentless. The makeshift medical camp outside the collapsed mining facility was a chaotic scene. The rescued workers lay on stretchers, their injuries tended to by a mix of human and Thalkren medics. Oxygen tanks hissed as survivors took desperate gulps of air, their bodies still shaking from the ordeal. The acrid scent of smoke lingered, carried by the cold winds of Horus 6's barren surface. Lieutenant Kala Rain sat on the edge of a supply crate, gripping a hydration pack with hands that refused to stop trembling. Her entire body screamed in protest, but her mind refused to shut down. 12 hours. They had pushed for 12 straight hours. Sergeant Milo Kent dropped onto the crate beside her, his exhaustion mirroring her own. He took a long swig from his water pouch before exhaling sharply. Well, he muttered, rubbing his eyes, that was a damn nightmare. Kala huffed out a dry laugh. We've had worse. Milo shot her a sideways glance. Have we? Before she could answer, Ambassador Tvok approached, his long robes swirling in the dust-laden wind. His normally pristine attire was smudged with soot and debris, and his usual air of superiority had dimmed. There was something different in his expression now, an uncertainty, a hesitance. He studied them for a long moment before finally speaking. You are still conscious? Milo snorted. Barely. Tvok's mandibles twitched, the Thalkren equivalent of a grimace. You should not be able to function after such exertion. The laws of biology dictate that prolonged stress, lack of sustenance and oxygen deprivation should have rendered you incapacitated long ago. Kala lifted an eyebrow. That your way of saying thank you? Tvok ignored the remark. This was beyond what we anticipated. We have always known humans to be persistent, but this level of defiance against physical limitation is something else entirely. Kala leaned forward, her arms resting on her knees. Let me ask you something, Ambassador, she said, voice raw with exhaustion. What would have happened if we didn't keep going? Tvok hesitated. More would have perished, he admitted. Exactly, Kala said. So we didn't stop. Tvok studied her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Milo stretched, his joints popping. Humans don't have a built-in quit function, Tvok. We push through exhaustion, pain, and bad odds because if we don't, people die. Simple as that. The ambassador nodded slowly, but Kala could see the conflict behind his dark eyes. The Thalkren saw endurance as a resource with strict limitations. Humans saw it as a challenge to overcome. Before Tvok could respond, a commotion erupted near the medical tents. Kala was on her feet instantly, adrenaline shoving past her exhaustion. What now? Milo groaned but followed her as they jogged toward the disturbance. A group of Thalkren engineers and medics were gathered near the edge of the camp, their voices raised in alarm. In the center of the commotion, a human medic, Corporal Yen Su, was kneeling beside a still figure, a Thalkren miner who had been among the last rescued. His body twitched violently, his breathing erratic. What's happening? Kala demanded. Lien's face was tight with frustration. His oxygen levels are plummeting. I think internal injuries are worse than we thought. A Thalkren medic, Vaxer, wrung his clawed hands. He needs an emergency transfusion. We do not have compatible donors on site. The nearest medical vessel is 4 hours away. Kala's gut twisted. He doesn't have 4 hours? Vaxer's mandibles clicked in distress. We have already given him all stabilizers available. There is nothing more to be done. Bullshit, Milo snapped. There's always something. Lien was already adjusting the med scanner. The problem is oxygen transport, his hemocyanin levels are failing. If we can oxygenate his bloodstream manually, we might keep him stable until evac. Fox stiffened. That procedure is experimental. The failure rate is? We don't have the luxury of statistics, Ambassador, Kala interrupted. Lien, what do you need? The medic didn't hesitate. We need a controlled reoxygenation cycle, but their biology rejects artificial hemocyanin substitutes. We need real blood with a high oxygen binding capacity. Milo blinked. Wait, are you saying? Lien gave him a meaningful look. Milo groaned. Oh hell. Kala exhaled sharply. I'll do it. Tvaka's eyes widened. You intend to give your own blood? Humans have hemoglobin, Lien explained. It binds oxygen more efficiently than hemocyanin. If we can process it through a transfusion filter, it might work as a temporary solution. Vaxer shook his head violently. That is reckless. It is untested. And even if it did work, humans do not regenerate blood quickly. You are already at the edge of collapse. Kala rolled up her sleeve. Then I guess we better not waste time debating it. Tvak looked at her in what could only be described as disbelief. You just spent 12 hours pushing yourselves beyond logical limits? And now you intend to drain your own life essence to sustain another? Kala met his gaze, unwavering. Yeah. Tvaka's mouth opened then closed. He had no words. Lien had already set up the transfusion system, modifying the filter for interspecies compatibility. All right, let's do this. As the needle slid into her arm, Kala felt a strange sense of weightlessness, a deep fatigue settling into her bones. She was already drained beyond reason, but this was different. The Thalkren miner's breathing steadied as the transfusion began. It was working. Milo sat beside her, watching her closely. You good? She nodded faintly. Just tired? Tvak watched the scene in stunned silence. This is not natural, he muttered. No species should be able to endure this. Milo smirked. Yeah, you keep saying that. The transfusion lasted just under 20 minutes. Kala was pale and weak when it finished, but she managed to sit up on her own. The Thalkren miner's vitals had stabilized. He would live. Tvak stared at her as if she were some kind of anomaly. You should not have survived that. Kala smirked tiredly. You keep underestimating us. Tvak looked at her, then at the humans scattered throughout the camp, injured, exhausted, battered beyond reason. And still standing. Still fighting. He exhaled slowly, realization dawning upon him. You humans, he said softly, you are impossible. Kala let out a breathless chuckle. Yeah, we get that a lot. The first thing Kala noticed when she woke up was the headache. A deep, pounding pressure behind her eyes, the kind of exhaustion that felt woven into her bones. She had only meant to rest her eyes for a moment. Judging by the dimmed light of the medical tent, she must have been out for hours. Milo was slouched in a chair beside her cot, arms crossed, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. He looked about as wrecked as she felt. How long? She rasped. Milo cracked an eye open. 5 hours. She blinked. 5. You passed out like a sack of bricks after the transfusion? He smirked. Frankly, I was impressed you even stayed upright that long. Kala sat up slowly, her muscles protesting the movement. The world swayed for a moment, and Milo reached out instinctively, steadying her shoulder. Easy, he warned. Your body's still trying to replace what you lost. Kala ignored him, swinging her legs off the cot. Status report? Milo sighed but humored her. Evac ships finally arrived. The last of the injured are being prepped for transport back to the orbital station. The tunnels are too unstable for further operations. Thalkren High Command has already declared the mining facility a total loss. And casualties? Milo's smirk faded. He hesitated. Kala's stomach twisted. Milo? He ran a hand through his hair. 38 dead. Another 19 critical. If we had stopped at the recommended 2-hour mark. His jaw clenched. It would have been well over 100. Kala exhaled sharply. They had done everything they could. They had pushed beyond reason, beyond logic. And yet it still wasn't enough for everyone. It never was. She scrubbed a hand down her face, trying to shove away the guilt gnawing at her chest. And the Thalkren? Milo snorted. Well, let's just say we broke their brains a little. Kala frowned. Milo gestured toward the tent flap. See for yourself. She stood, slowly, carefully, and stepped outside. The first thing she noticed was the silence. The camp, which had been a frenzy of movement and controlled chaos for hours, now felt eerily still. Thalkren workers, medics, and engineers stood in small clusters, murmuring to one another in their guttural, clicking language. But what struck her wasn't their conversations. It was the way they looked at the humans. Before, the Thalkren had regarded them with polite indifference, the way one might observe a primitive species that had somehow stumbled its way into the stars. Now their expressions were different. Caution. A hint of something else, something like fear. Tvok stood near the center of the camp, his back stiff as he conferred with another Thalkren official. His usual arrogance had been stripped away, replaced with something far more unsettled. He turned the moment he spotted Kala, his dark eyes narrowing as he approached. "You should still be resting," he said. Kala folded her arms. "I've had worse." His mandibles twitched in frustration. "That is precisely what I do not understand." She raised an eyebrow. "What part?" Tvok's jaw tightened. "All of it." He gestured broadly toward the humans still working in the camp, assisting with final evacuations. "You should not have lasted 12 hours in those tunnels. You should not have been able to function after such exertion. And you, Lieutenant, most certainly should not have survived a cross-species blood transfusion while already on the brink of collapse." Kala smirked. "You keep saying that?" Tvok's hands curled into fists. "Because it should be impossible." Kala shrugged. "And yet here we are." Tvok exhaled slowly, his frustration giving way to something deeper. "I have spent years studying human physiology. Your kind has always been an anomaly, short-lived, fragile, prone to injury. We assumed you were limited by the same constraints as other species." He met her gaze. "But I see now that we were wrong." Kala tilted her head. "Wrong how?" Tvok hesitated as if struggling to find the words. Then he said, "We believed endurance was a matter of physical capability. We thought the limits of the body dictated the limits of the individual." His gaze darkened. "But humans, your endurance is not of the body. It is of the mind. You do not stop even when you should. Even when every logical system dictates that you must." Kala's smirk faded. Tvok took a step closer. "That is not resilience. That is madness." Kala held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Maybe." Tvok studied her for a long moment. "You frighten us." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Kala crossed her arms. "Good." Tvok exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "I must report to High Command. They will need to be informed." "Of what?" He met her eyes. "That we have underestimated humanity." Then, with a final lingering glance at the humans still working, he turned and walked away. Milo appeared at Kala's side, watching Tvok's retreating form. "Well," he muttered, "that's gonna be fun for their command structure." Kala smirked faintly. "I think we just broke their worldview." Milo snorted. "We tend to do that." She sighed, rubbing the exhaustion from her eyes. "Come on. We still have work to do." And without another word, she strode back into the camp. Even now, even on the brink of collapse, she refused to stop. The last of the evac transports lifted off, its engines roaring as it ascended toward the waiting orbital fleet. The winds of Horus 6 howled through the now empty mining camp, scattering dust over the abandoned ruins. What had once been a bustling operation was now nothing but wreckage and memories. Kala stood near the landing pad, watching the ship disappear into the stratosphere. The exhaustion in her bones was a familiar weight, one she had long since learned to ignore. Milo trudged up beside her, his jacket zipped tight against the biting cold. "That's the last of them," he said, rubbing at a sore spot on his shoulder. "Medical teams are taking over on the station. The injured will make it." Kala let out a breath. "Good." A tense silence settled between them. The kind that only came after the fight was over, when the adrenaline wore off, and the mind started catching up with everything that had happened. Milo glanced at her. "You all right?" Kala smirked, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Been better." He snorted. Understatement of the year. She didn't argue. Across the camp, the remaining Thalkren workers were preparing their own withdrawal. Supply crates were being packed, and engineers were dismantling what little equipment remained. But more than that, there was a shift in how they moved, how they spoke. They were subdued. Thoughtful. Changed. Tvok stood at the edge of the group, his usual rigid posture softer somehow, his mandibles clicking in quiet contemplation. He turned when he noticed Kala and Milo approaching. "You are leaving?" Kala asked. He inclined his head. "There is nothing left for us here." Pause. Then quietly he added, "We owe you a debt." Kala arched an eyebrow. "A debt?" Tvok exhaled, his mandibles twitching. "This mission, it should have been a failure. We had already prepared the casualty reports. We had accepted the losses." His dark eyes met hers. "But you refused to accept them. Even when it defied logic." Even when it risked your own survival? Kala shrugged. It wasn't about logic. It was about saving lives. Tvok studied her for a long moment. That is the difference between us. She tilted her head. What do you mean? He clasped his hands behind his back. The Thalkren have always considered ourselves an advanced species. We thrive on efficiency, on order. We believe in calculated risk, in knowing when to retreat. A beat of silence. Humans do not think this way. You fight beyond reason. You endure beyond limits. You bleed for those who are not even your own. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. It is something we do not fully understand. But I believe it is why you have survived in this galaxy. Kala smirked. It's not the first time we've been called stubborn. Tvok shook his head. Stubbornness is refusing to change. This is something else. Milo crossed his arms. So what now? You go back to High Command and tell them humans are reckless lunatics. Tvok exhaled. I go back and tell them that we were wrong. Kala raised an eyebrow. He continued, for years, we have underestimated your kind. We saw your short lifespans as a weakness. We saw your emotions as a liability. We assumed your endurance was bound by the same rules as our own. His mandibles tightened. But today we saw something different. Milo snorted. What, that we're too stupid to quit? Tvok's eyes gleamed. That you refused to lose. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Kala felt the corners of her lips tug upward. Took you long enough to figure that out? Tvok let out a low, rumbling chuckle. Perhaps. He turned slightly, glancing at the departing Thalkren ships. Then, with something almost like admiration, he added, we may not be so different after all. Kala met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. A quiet understanding. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new. Tvok gave a final nod before stepping away, joining his people as they prepared to leave. Milo exhaled, rocking back on his heels. Well, that was a hell of a thing. Kala smirked. Yeah, it was. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the last of the Thalkren ships lifted off, disappearing into the sky. Milo stretched, groaning. So, you think this means they'll actually start listening to us? Kala chuckled. Doubt it? Milo snorted. Figures. She clapped him on the shoulder. Come on. Let's go home. And with that, they turned toward their own ship, walking away from the wreckage, toward whatever came next. For the first time in history, the Thalkren had seen the true endurance of humanity. And they would never forget it.